I'm here to talk about two things. The first is important. That is what David did. Any computer scientist and any person in any related field should know about that. But the much more important thing that I'll try to weave through is who David was. That we can all profit from that. We can all strive to be a person more like David. I could just stand here and enumerate the list. That wouldn't be very interesting. I'll mention, I'll see if this one works. This is the one that had the most questions when I reviewed this, about David as party animal. But every summer, he would throw this wonderful get-together. It started off just for the summer students. It expanded for all of Bell Labs. When they went over to Florham Park as AT&T, it was a huge way for us to get together every summer. But this grew and grew and grew until it really was a time to get together. David was, in the best sense of the word, a community organizer. We've heard about it, whether it's DIMACS or the lunch table or the mixers or his parties. David made communities happen. One thing I never realized about it until I thought about it is that, please come in. Please come in. Do you want to introduce them? Yeah. This is the two people David loved most in the world, his beautiful wife and handsome young son.
Good to see you.
Oh, Jack, pleasure to see you. How you doing? So I was talking about David being a party animal. He organized this party at his home. It was such a great deal of work, but it meant so much to everyone. This is wonderful timing. I have here that David was a great compromiser. I'll take his example of when David Johnson married Dorothy Wilson. There was the issue of what should their last name be. And they went back and forth to many of them, but David had the eminently reasonable proposal of taking the first syllable of his last name and the second syllable of her last name. And somehow, yeah, she refused, but you can see that he was a great compromiser, a very funny guy. David was a superb writer. His book with Mike Gary will stand forever as a monument to what NP completeness is. Likewise with this column, I was so fortunate to have him as a colleague and friend. I was writing the column for communications of the ACM. He was writing his column. We'd swap back and forth. But his writing goes back a very, very, very far distance. I had the great delight to talk with his mother at one of the parties, who swore that the story he told in his MIT PhD thesis was true, that up until the age of 2, he pretty much said nothing.
Oh, you're stealing my thunder.
I apologize.
It's great.
But at the age of 2, suddenly, David, the incredibly elegant writer, had something important to say, so he said, please.
Well, the first thing he said basically was, that's a ceiling up there.
Everyone look up, and it's still true. That's the ceiling up there. That was the first thing he said, a superb writer. But David also was a just judge. We all got copies of this, if you look back here, of his wonderful paper on the Theoretician's Guide. In the Theoretician's Guide, that Kathy referred to so often, he had 8 suggestions and 35 pet peeves. David had a finely tuned bullshit detector, and if you asked him about something, he would give you an honest answer. And I fear that if David were here right now, he'd be giving me that look. Sort of, definitely not a smile, sort of a look of move on, get to the good stuff. He would want me to talk about his great technical corpus, and I will, but not before I say that he was a dear, dear friend, and by any measure imaginable, a real sweetie. So we'll talk more about that later, but what excellent timing that you all had to get here. Kathy referred to David's thesis 50 years ago next month. 30 years before that, there weren't computers. computers hadn't been invented yet. This is really back in the Stone Age, and his thesis looks so far ahead. He did a marvelous thesis on bin packing. He proved some outstanding worst-case theorems. Chapter 7, as Kathy mentioned, was empirical tests. For most of his tests, he went out to size n equals 200. 200, it was a quadratic. He was implementing n-log n algorithms, but they were in Lisp, so they had some quadratic overhead. That's all he could do. Every now and then he went hog wild and went out to 1,000. Kathy and I independently got to the same thing where we went out to 1,000 pieces. And back in the day when computers cost millions of dollars and time was precious, that was a lot of work. Great theoretical work. His maximum n was 1,000. I think that one of his rules here that he wouldn't mind if we applied to himself: never trust a so-called expert on experimental analysis. Kathy mentioned the summer of '83. It's remarkable how over the years I have turned into a bitter old man, and Kathy is still the same lovely young lady that she was then. Kathy came to work with me. David had a great team submitted to the annealing that Kathy has already described. Boy, what a crummy advisor David is. A chaired professor at Amherst, a professor at the University of Washington. She's only an associate professor with a PhD and an MD at Columbia School of Medicine. But David was an outstanding PhD advisor. I had a great advisor, Don Stannett. David was one of my real advisors. Just what a teacher. We had some kid from MIT named Leighton. Looks like he has potential. I hear that recently he's been sidetracked. He's running a little business on the side. But he was doing good work. We got into the bin packing problem where we did experiments, we did theorems with the 5 of us. What fun. And the first thing we started with was that David looked at the difference. We looked here, as Kathy mentioned, at the empty space on a log-log scale. Wow, it doesn't grow linearly, it grows as root n. That's amazing if the weights are uniform from 0 to 1. But if the weights are uniform from 0 to 0.5, how does it grow? And the answer that shocked us was, it doesn't grow. If the weights are uniform from 0 to 0.5 and you pack n weights, we went out to 128,000. And it was always pretty much uniform between 0.2 and 1.2. I should point out here that David dealt with 3 kinds of data, as it were. One is in the worst case. He proved these wonderful theorems, incredibly complex theorems with 15 different induction hypotheses going on about the worst case behavior. David analyzed the average case behavior, as he referred to it, for distributions of random data, but he loved real data. David and I started working on this from 2 different things, from 2-dimensional bin packing. I started on it from a multi-chip project in 1979 of putting a bunch of individual VLSI designs on chips, and David started on it. He was a great consultant of looking at a whole bunch of pictures in the Metropolitan Museum of Art as a 2-dimensional bin packing problem. Do people in museums care about bin packing pictures? That's ridiculous. In the average museum, they display 5 to 10%, sometimes only 1% of their holdings. All the rest of the stuff they keep downstairs. And downstairs in these incredibly expensive rooms, they have all these wonderful artworks that they care about jamming together as close as they can in a 2-dimensional bin packing problem. So David loved real data, he loved distributions, he loved the worst case, but in this time we were playing with this distribution. In his thesis, he went out to 1,000. The summer that Kathy worked with us, she went out to 128,000, a lot bigger. We drew pictures of those. The experiments showed that the empty space was uniform from 0.2 to 1.2. We proved that it was constant. It was less than 10 to the 10th. That's an integer. It's compared to most integers, it's really small. But compared to some integers, it's pretty big. Sally Floyd and Dick Karp in '91 tightened it a little bit, down to 11.3. But still, we knew it was between 0.2 and 1.2. Well, to look at this, after Kathy and I came back from a dog stool that David had organized, we said, well, hey, wait a second. There are two sources of empty space. One is along the tops. Can we study that? And then the last, it's sort of a function of just how much space there is in the whole thing. The last one is sort of uniform in that area. So we did, when we returned from a dog show that David had organized, we wrote something called a bin lab for experiments on bins. And we did experiments from 100 out to 1 million. From 200 to 1,000, 228,000 to 1 million. We're on a roll here. And we saw that the empty space converges pretty quickly. This is 0.15, that's 0.19. It converges to something like 0.18. So they tightened it from, we observed from 0.2 to 1.2. We proved 10 to the 10th. Floyd and Karp got down to 11.3. We want to get a little bit tighter here. So now we can say that the empty space in the whole packing is about 0.18 here, and then another random variable of weights in the last bin. Well, we did that 18 years ago. In preparation for this talk, I cranked up some of our old code and went out to 100 million. Getting things warmed up a little bit here. And we saw the same thing here, that this is 0.18. And now we can really see if I start at 10,000 here and go out to 100 million, it has the same shape of the curve. Well, this curve is sort of wide at the side, narrows down here. It's wide, it narrows down. Is it self-similar? Does it go all the way out? I'd love to look at this on a log scale. Well, if I try a log scale, I'm going to be nuked because there's so many weird values here. So what I'll do is subtract the mean here of the last few, then take the absolute value and look at that on the log scale. And if I do that, Saturday, I said, gee, this is for David. I can't just stop at 100 million. Nice round number. Let's go to 1 billion. In his thesis 50 years ago, he did most at 200. The computing world has changed. I'm just an old pensioned off programmer from the telephone company, and I can do this with my pet computer with no problem. So the top empty space is that on a log scale. So here we can see that it converges to that value. And we can tell about the convergence that at 1 billion, the numbers are always within about a 10,000th and 100,000th. So we can really get a view here. Of course, David is peering over my shoulder here, saying that one of his pet peeves is, we've analyzed, but cut me some slack. It's nice to think about this. It's great to see how over the years we can get a really detailed view if you want to. I'll point out too that this optimal packing is using David's n-log-n heap-derived algorithm for the packing. We can pack 1 billion weights in 4 minutes, 2.5 minutes to sort them, 1.5 minutes to run David's n-log-n algorithm here. David did it all. That's asymptopia. I've tried to wet your whistle for asymptopia. The next guy up is going to really talk about what it's like out there. This is the cool part. But I want to look back and see, is there anything interesting that we can learn by looking near the origin? If you like it, you like it. If you don't like it, you can chalk this up to this being my original sin. I'll diagram it for you. The TSP. No need to go into that one here. I want to have code to solve the TSP for n points on the unit square, make n as large as possible, use any tools you want to, but a couple hundred lines of C code. Ballpark, in a couple hundred lines of C, how big a TSP random points on the unit square do you think you can solve? If you had to write it fresh in a couple hundred lines of...
Solve exactly?
Solve exactly. You have to solve exactly. About how large could you solve?
1,000. 150.
150? Wow. That's why he gets to sit in the expensive seats. We'll talk about that. I get, one question is, well, in how much time?
Oh, you didn't say that.
I didn't say that. Here's something I learned. I'll say it's between 1 second and 10 to the factorial, 10 factorial seconds. What is 10 factorial seconds?
I think something 15 days, 13 days. I forgot.
10 factorial seconds is exactly, this is great. Look at the factors, a 6 and a 7 and a 10 and a 4. 6 weeks. 10 factorial seconds is 6. So between a second and 6 weeks, how far can you, we'll see about that. But how far we can solve it. When I give this talk to undergraduates, I encourage them to read this book, In Pursuit of the Traveling Salesman. I can't read the author. Sir, this random person right here, can you read the author of that?
Some sort of Willie Jameson or something.
Okay. Great book. Father's Day is coming up. This is the definitive Father's Day present. And for those of you who missed Mother's Day, this is the only acceptable backup Mother's Day present there is. So look at the graph, tell me how this, wow. Talk about the Concord TSP solver. Why should we consider it tiny when Jumbo already solves the problem? Well, when I talk to students about this, this is one way that you might attack an NP-hard problem. It's a master class in algorithms. It's a venerable pastime. David talked about this. He wrote a cool lecture in his own style on 25 March 2014 about how I spent my spring break doing this. Yeah, get off my back, it is. So here's a nice recursive algorithm, a backtracking algorithm to check all permutations. The code doesn't matter much. These are already fixed. Permute these. So for I gets 0 up to m, swap it, search recursively, swap again. Go through that. If you have done much backtracking, you recognize it. If not, you're all mature enough to appreciate what's going on here. That's the algorithm. It's called originally like this. It takes about that much time. In fact, for permutations, n of each. Can you make that faster at all?
No, that's it.
That's it, okay.
Thank you.
Excellent. So here's a man who's not going to go too far. He's not going to go to any extremes or anything. Well, one thing is, well, hey, you look at the last city. If I fix the last city, that quickly I can get a factor of n. The next ones are a bit slower. Pre-compute all of them in a matrix. Keep the partial sums going along. One cool thing about that was that the lead term of n minus 1 factorial is not n. It starts off being 2, then 3, then 3.5. What does this look like? 3.71828. It's 1 plus e. And this turned out to be a nice entry in Neil Sloan's integer sequences. If anyone didn't see it already, Sunday in the New York Times, there was an exceptionally great article about that. Go back and read it if you haven't seen it yet. We started off backtracking. Let's go to branch and bound. If I just add these 2 lines of code to prove the search, it's no longer as easy to analyze, but it's a lot faster. Are there better bounds than that? Well, we start off with just the sum so far plus the minimum spanning tree. It has to be at least that far. Here, I carry along a new representation, a bit mask. I compute the MST of that, and that's a whole lot faster still. Better yet, include the 2 truer-ends. I computed all the MSTs over and over again. We'll cache the MSTs. There's space-efficient ones. Here we just look at the cities in random order. If we sort the cities, well, that's a lot faster. But rather than doing an n-log-n sort, we can use an approximate sort, where we always find the minimum. And here's how it looks. In 1978, one of my motivations was my colleague Mike Seamus wrote his thesis. He couldn't solve a problem of size n equals 16. It didn't make sense for a grad student to write a program to do that. So that was sort of my motivation immediately. In 1997, Well, you could go out pretty big pretty quick. In 5 minutes, you could do that. In 2016, with faster machines and just a little bit more cleverness, you can hold your breath to solve a problem. So here we're getting that to 45 pretty easily. What exactly is an approximate sort? I won't give you all the details. If it were exactly sorted, these points would be in a line. If it's just the minimum, this point's down here. But here, an approximate sort in n-1 comparisons it's not perfectly sorted. It's only that much code. So if you need to do certain searches and you've been using a sort, well, maybe this sort is good enough, and the data says it is in a number of contexts. So here's the complete code. In under 200 lines of C, by about 10, as a matter of fact. Here's everything I've talked about: the minimum spanning tree, the hashing, the approximate sort, the recursive solver, the driver. And I can solve a 60-city tour sometimes in 40 minutes. So again, compared to what the big kids do, very unimpressive. But for undergraduates seeing that this is something that they can follow every step all the way along, it's been sort of fun. At this point, I talk about exactly what the big kids do and mention things that you'll hear about a lot shortly, I trust, about how these guys have done great things, and ours is just a tiny little approximation to learn how to use this. How did this come together? David started on simulated annealing, moved to the TSP, then got into experimental analysis. I personally started on geometry, looked at nearest neighbor searching, looked at fast algorithms for minimum spanning trees. I thought people would do other things. No one did nothing for 15 years. The time came, and in the late 1980s, I'd been working on some tools for graphical displays, animations. My colleague Bjarne Strastrup had been messing with a new programming language. So we looked at a number of problems, and several papers came out of it. Basically, I got to be the bat boy for a TSP dream team. That David and Lyle McGew were David was the heart of the team. Lyle McGew was right there assisting him. Ed Rothberg and a number of other people were doing this. I got to have a little uniform and a tiny little bat, and they patted my head every now and then. And best time of my life. It all came together there. I would really be curious. The runtime took 3.5 hours then. How much time is this today? David warned, watch out, your machines may change, well, your compilers may change too. The language may change. This ancient C++ code doesn't run. I wish I could tell you the time, but that's gone. So I gave a talk about this. And finally at MIT, I was challenged to, can you do better? Can we increase M each year? Can we learn something interesting? And one thing that came out was Charles Lyserson said, can you use 2-opt to make it better? My view is that, well, David had taught us that 2-opt is 6 to 9% over optimal. That was just beaten into my brain. 2-opt is about that much over optimal. 2-opt is useless for the optimal one. Charles persisted, can you use 2-opt in the optimal? Well, let's give it a try. I could use it at the beginning, where I start with the 2-opt tour. At the end, as I get another tour, I could 2-opt it beforehand. But here is the interesting part. When I'm adding a new edge, if it creates a potential 2-opt swap, I can prune the tour right there. Looks pretty good. Well, how do these work? And yeah, this one takes about that much code. It's really, really simple. And how effective are these? This doesn't work at all. It decreases n by 1. This, you can go out a couple more. This, you can go out a couple more. But if you put these together, it seems to be pretty powerful. And here is a graph of one point set. How far can I get on the one point set with algorithm 1, the very first algorithm you saw, and it blasts up here. This is on a linear log scale. And you see here that the line starts as being huge, and it's getting further and further over here. And I'm pushing them down, and finally we can go out here to about n equals 76 in a couple days. Wow, that's pretty cool. Bill Polyblank, who has taught me so much, he's taught the world a great deal, especially in your book, but I visited him up at West Point Mathematics Department, where I got this cool t-shirt. If you walk down the street, people come up to you and say, what exactly is Army math? Bill far prefers to have it on this view of the hockey stick view, where instead of putting it on a log scale, you put it on a linear scale over here. And you can see that you have 3 regions here that Bob Sedgwick identified. This is the last algorithm. There's the insignificant region here where it takes so little time you can't even measure it. Then there's the impossible region over there. And in between is the interesting region. So this is how the algorithms get better. This is a hockey stick view where I'm trying to push the blade out further and further and push the blade down. I mentioned hockey sticks. I think of Kathy. Kathy, please. Kathy has written a website of hockey haiku.
As you know, John was my advisor, and I have to do what he tells me. And he knows I'm a huge hockey fan, except those of you who know I'm a Bruins fan, so that's get me started. And he said, when I say hockey stick, you have to stand up and say something. And so I will now recite what's been called the greatest poem in all of sport. Number 4, Bobby Orr.
You can't do this without poetry to support you. So to improve David's 6 to 9%, I decided to take the best of 1,000 2-ops. Just run it 1,000 times. It took the time up to a whopping 40 milliseconds to do that. The starting tour was almost always optimal. I had this prejudice that 2-opting was 6 to 9%. Well, but if you do it enough, it's always optimal. I didn't expect that. I saw it only because I took David's advice and used profiling. So I wanted to compare 2-op to optimal tours. So for 9 sets, I wanted to find the first TSP of endpoints as large as possible. And here is for 9 different point sets, how much time it took to solve on a linear log scale for n equals 10 up to 60. And you see that there's variation there. For just 9 sets, the time runs from 1.5 minutes to 55 hours. This is a small sample. Explore to find good questions. A great question is, what backtracking, branch and bound, are some of our workhorse algorithms, yet no one really knows, as far as I can see, what the runtime is for them. So let's explore the runtime of backtracking and branch and bound on this TSP. What will it be? Can we get some idea about that? On 9 point sets, I went out 2-opt, always found the optimal. I then used chained 3-opt, and that was even better. So 2-opt almost always found the optimal. Chained 3-opt found it for every known tour. I'm sorry, David. That's chain 3-opt, and that's the chain 3-opt kick, one of the classic kicks of chain 3-opt. At n equals 60, it takes a few seconds. Doug McElroy observed that apparently taking 1,000 shots with a pop gun is as effective as the heavy artillery of Lynn Kernaghan. This is about how much code a chained 2-opt, 2.5-opt, and 3-opt takes, about 150 lines. Next summer, 2 core years on 32 cores, I studied 1,000 point sets. I solved all but one at n equals 60. That one really bugged me. I let it run for 2 months. It didn't finish. I started it again. I went back and read Moby Dick and realized that this guy had some serious psychological issues going on here, frankly. So one chain of chained 3-opt was optimal all but 25 times. I was stuck in the notion that 3-opt gives you about 3% over optimal, but in fact, chained 3-opt was optimal a whole lot. How much search time did it take? Well, if we start with a tour, that takes our branch and bound and turns branch and bound back into backtrack. Knuth in the 4B tells us that backtrack programs are full of surprises. Sometimes they're blazing fast, other times you'll wait much longer than the heat death of the universe. Here, for 1,000 sets, 22 times it didn't equal 60, it was less than 6 seconds. 22 times, it was more than 12 days. Yikes. But I messed around with it for a week, and finally I found that if I took the log of the nose visits and then have a count in the bucket, it sort of had an interesting shape there. Is it I don't know. Well, 25 years ago, these folks in an AI talk observed that backtracking under certain stochastic assumptions can be log normal. Maybe that's the normal distribution. This is a different thing. This is a 7-number summaries at 2%, 9%, 25%, 50%, 75, 91, and 98%. If those 7 lines are parallel if they're all straight and they're gradually spreading out, that means that it's doing that it's growing exponentially, with the 2nd% growing at that rate and the 98th% growing at that rate. I did it more, where the next year I used, I think it was about 6.5 years of time. I got 3 sets of 125. Not as large as you would have done in half an hour, but it's cool to use it. And I thought, boy, I'm going to get these 3 sets. I'm going to see how these compare to random sets, and I'll see the structure in here. So I was ready to look at the random sets, and I think that if Freud had tours instead of ink blots, he might have amounted to something. Dancing doggy, they're all dancing doggy there. I couldn't see any structure, I lose. But now I had better histograms. Here is the log of node visits. Is that sort of normally shaped? Well, here, normal is e to the minus x squared. If I take the log of that as parabolic, so it's just minus x squared, so you get this parabola. Is that roughly shaped parabolically? And are these lines converging? I'm not sure, but I think that as an engineering approximation, you can say that backtrack on Euclidean TSP instances appears to take log normal time. It's worth investigating. It's a really fun class to give to seniors. I've been giving this to seniors at Lehigh and at MIT for a few years. It's been really fun, where it just brings a lot of things together. David warned us to perform newsworthy experiments. I stumbled across this sequence, approximate sorting, 2-opt and 3-opt pruning. Thanks, Charles, were sort of interesting. The log normal runtime, 2-opt and 3-opt chained appear to find optimal tours for n into around 100 at least. Wow. And if I have to attack a small problem, I now consider attacking it by looking at 1 set in detail, then 10, then 1,000, then 100,000. That worked out pretty well. Over the years, the size has increased a lot. Final thoughts. Along the way for preparing this, I stumbled across a new application of TSPs, which is if you have story 1, say about a person and his accomplishments, and story 2 about who the person is, trying to weave them together, if you have 25 points, into an optimal thing, is an interesting computational problem. Next up is, I referred to that I was I got to play on a TSP dream team, and I did. David led the team, but the TSP dream team has 4 core members, 2 of whom are sitting next to each other right here. And the next talk, you will hear about that. And I worked at the origin. These guys are going to talk about how they go to asymptopia and beyond. 40-some years ago, when I first started working on the TSP, Christos told me that the TSP isn't a problem, it's an addiction. After 40 years, I can respond to Christos, well, the difference between me and an addict is that I can quit whenever I want to. We'll let David have the last word. One of his pitfalls is getting into an endless loop in your experimentation. The problem, the TSP, but more importantly, the man. Any comments, any questions? Kathy.
So your, the last part, really fast, finding the 2-op to 3-op tours. How much time does branching bound take if you start with the optimal tour? Is that what you look at?
That's what I've been looking at. That at first, it wasn't a backtracking algorithm because I didn't start with the optimal, but once you are very sure that you start with optimal, and that stunned me. I had this conceptual block, just like David did, and he was looking at the ratio of bins used to optimal, and we had to break things, look at the difference. I knew that 2-opt and 3-opt couldn't produce the optimal tour. And I was therefore sort of counting when it didn't find it. I was just stunned that 2-opt and 3-opt, for n up to 100 or so, found the optimal tour. The chain 2-opt and 3-opt in 150 lines of code solved the whole thing for this class of instances. Sir?
Did you think about trying adding node weights to your MST lower bounds so you actually become essentially a health card?
That's the next thing to do. I have thought about it several times. I want to do it in 25 lines of code, and I've thought about it a lot, and it always takes a few hundred or 1,000 lines of code, 50 at least. So I'm looking at that. That's something that I'm very excited to do, to see how David did that in his thing, getting a better lower bound. But I think that that's the one thing to do. But right now, I don't know if that's interesting, because I think the interesting thing may be here that for anywhere where you can use this, you don't need to, because chain 3-op solves it. And that'll be sort of fun, to do this magic act where I get this algorithm and I really understand it, and by the time you understand it, you understand this component, the branch and bound search, you understand this component, the 3-op start, and you can say that wherever this would be at all plausible, wherever it would use less than decades of computer time, this one solves it almost exactly in seconds. I don't know how it's going to end. I have to go back here. Does anyone recognize what that is? This is another homage to David. I give this talk at MIT each year. At MIT, what does this mean? IHTFP is found everywhere at MIT, which means things like Institute has the finest professors, or I have to find path, or I hate this fucking place. So that's another hidden homage to David. IHTFP. Any other questions? I tried to finish with my allocated time.
Oh, okay.